Hello, all, and welcome to the second part of Week Three's lecture. So, for the second part, we're going to be talking about Louis Althusser. This is Louis here. And Louis was a French Marxist philosopher who was born in Algeria and later went on to study in Paris, where he eventually became a professor of philosophy. And he was a longtime member, although one that sometimes was not in good standing, of the French Communist Party. And many of his arguments, his philosophical arguments, and his general thesis were set against the threats that he saw attacking the theoretical foundations of Marxism. This had to do with the influence of empiricism on Marxist theory, as well as humanist and reformist socialist orientations, which manifested as divisions in the European communist parties. So, Althusser is kind of an interesting fellow. He suffered throughout his life from mental illness and later in his life murdered his wife and essentially got away with it, which sort of shows you the status that he held as an intellectual in Paris at the time. In Europe, intellectuals are treated quite differently than they are in the United States. In all fairness, his his problems with his wife or the murder was likely brought on by his mental illness, which I'm guessing was probably related to dementia and so on. But it is true that he did, in fact, murder his wife. Also, interestingly, towards the end of his life, he came out and told sort of everyone he used to work with that he never even read Marx. And of course, he spent his whole life as a Marxist philosopher, which is kind of funny. Again, I think this was probably likely due to his mental illness, but if not, then it's really hilarious. Okay, so why is he interesting, right? Why is he important? Well, what you see here with Althusser is that he has an argument that indeed is very similar to the argument that's made by Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci, if you recall from the first part of this lecture, came up with this idea of cultural hegemony, which was all about how the ruling class maintains power. And he ultimately said, what was clever about Gramsci was he said, listen, hegemony or power is maintained in two different ways. The first way is through the use of force, but that isn't the primary way. The primary way is the second way, and that's through the manufacture of what he called spontaneous consent, right? In other words, through ideology, through exposing people routinely throughout their lives to the ideas of the ruling class, you could make people believe that these ideas were really common sense, and so they agreed with the system. They agreed to be led and be ruled over because it just made sense to them to do so. So what happens with Althusser is he takes this a step further and he looks at the institutions that exist in society. And when I say institutions, I don't mean just like schools and hospitals and so on, but social institutions, things like marriage, family, right? All these kinds of institutions. And he sort of divides them up to see how they function within society, and specifically with regard to ideology. So he's a Marxist. He believes in this notion of ideology as well as kind of a false consciousness, and he believes that it's something that's instilled in the working classes as common sense. And so he's on board with Gramsci and with Marx all the way. But where he's different, and what's important about him is that he goes through and he identifies the institutions and the ways in which they help the ruling class stay in charge. And so he divides them up into the RSA, which he calls the repressive state apparatus, and the ISA, right, which is the ideological state apparatus. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. So to define each, he begins with the repressive state apparatus, and he says it's a tool that's used by the ruling class to dominate the working class. And so therefore, the basic function of the repressive state apparatus, the RSA, is to act in favor of the ruling class by repressing the ruled class through violent and coercive means. Right? So this is the force or the dominance that Gramsci talked about. So for Althusser, there was this part of society that's generally regarded as the state or the government, and that this is the repressive state apparatus, and it uses its various arms, the police, the courts, the National Guard, the army, right, to suppress discontent or opposing voices, opposing actions through force, repress these folks, right, in favor of the ruling class, and indeed it's controlled by the ruling class, right, because it's more often than not, it's the ruling class that holds state power. It's the ruling class that is the political class, in other words. So for Althusser, the RSA, the repressive state apparatus, equals hard power. This is Gramsci's force. This is Althusser's RSA, and it equals ruling through force. Okay. Now, interestingly, even though there are all these different wings, the police, the courts, the army, even though there are all these different wings of the repressive state apparatus, for Althusser, it's all one unit. It's all one thing. It's all part of one apparatus, the repressive state apparatus, which again is controlled by the state. Okay? His second division, right, the second kind of institution or apparatus that he describes is the ISA, the ideological state apparatuses. So here you'll see there's more than one. And ISAs are soft power. These are the institutions that teach the ideology, that circulate the ideology, that in turn produce spontaneous consent of the masses. And these come in a whole bunch of different forms. They're all not related the same way that the repressive state apparatus arms are related. These are all sort of part of, I don't know, how would I describe it? They're all separate to the extent that we have a whole bunch of ISAs. We have religious ISAs, the family ISA, the media ISA, the cultural ISA, right? And again, these function primarily through ideology, through ideas, right? And the idea is that they take the ruling ideology, they teach it, they circulate it throughout the culture till it becomes sort of common sense. And this allows the state, the ruling class, to continue to operate the state and preserve what Gramsci would call cultural hegemony. Okay? So he describes these things in a little bit more detail. And he says the RSA, this repressive state apparatus, functions as a unified entity, an organized whole, as opposed to the ISA, which is diverse and plural, meaning that there's a lot of different ISAs, right? However, what unites these things, right, the ISAs, is the fact that they're ultimately controlled by the ruling ideology. So the RSA are all government controlled. They're all part of one government, one ruling political organization, right? The ISAs are all different, right? It could be your church, it could be your family that teaches you common sense and values, it could be the school that teaches you common sense and values, it could be the media that teaches you what to think, right? And all these are separate. They're all run by different people. They're not really directly related in the same way that government organizations are. However, in some sense, they're united because they're all controlled by the ruling ideology. They're all teaching basically the same thing, right? And indeed, sometimes these organizations even work together. So, for example, at my kids' school, they have a police officer who's kind of also a teacher, right? And he comes in and he does the lessons on drugs and runs the Dare to Stay Off Drugs program and all this. But he drives a cop car to work and he wears a uniform and, I mean, he's effectively part of the RSA, right? I mean, he's part of the repressive state apparatus. He's got a gun. He could billy club. He could beat you with and put you in jail if he wanted to. But he's also part of the RSA, right? Or I'm sorry, also part of the ISA because he's part of the school. He's kind of like a teacher, right? So there's this weird crossover. But nevertheless, the ideology is always the same, right? The ideology is always the same, which is the ruling class stays the ruling class, right? Now, here again, with number two, the RSA function predominantly by means of repression and violence. Right? So their number one reason for being is to keep people in line through repression and through violence. So this is the police, for example, right? Or the National Guard when they're mobilized by the governor in a particular state. Right? Their job is to keep everybody in line through violence or the direct threat of violence. Right? And they only function secondarily by ideology. Right? So in a prison, it's all about repression and violence and force. We're going to keep you in this cage. We're only going to let you out for these specific times. If you step out of line, we're going to beat you or put you in solitary confinement. But yet there's also certainly a kind of ideology, a way of thinking that's being expressed by the prison administration, prison guards, right? So it's primarily force and secondarily a kind of maintaining of the ruling class through ideology. With the ISA, right, the ISA functions predominantly by ideology and secondarily by repression and violence. So with the ISA, right, it's all about ideas, but that can also they can also fall back on violence if necessary. Now this of course recalls more directly the days of corporal punishment in schools. My father many years ago, before I was even born, was a high school teacher for a brief period of time, right? And when he taught high school in a rural area in Pennsylvania, they taught ideas and they had rules and everything was pretty much, they maintained order ideologically. But if you stepped out of line, they had a paddle. They would literally paddle you, right? I mean, they would hurt you if you didn't comply, right? Which, I mean, who knows if that's ultimately good or bad. But it certainly was effective, from what he tells me, right? But this is a demonstration of how an primarily ideological organization can also use violence to keep people in line. Now, what's the reason? I think I suggested previously that the more insidious or the more sneaky of these two forms is always ideology. If a guy's carrying a gun telling you what to do, it's pretty obvious what's happening. It's pretty obvious that you're being oppressed or you're being threatened. With ideology, it's not clear at all that you're being threatened, right? Because ideology, again, masquerades as common sense, common knowledge. And so as a result, if you go against it, it makes you not only seem unruly, but it makes you seem a little crazy, right? Like, why in the world? Like, don't you understand this is common sense, right? And so as a result, the ISA, the schools, the family, the churches, the media, these function in much more of a concealed and what Althusser calls a symbolic manner, right? Meaning that their manipulation is much harder to observe. I mean, it's certainly there, but it's much harder to observe. And so he goes on talking about these ISAs, and specifically he's talking later in the article about the role of school and church. And Althusser is writing this during a time when all of the world, and Europe in particular, is becoming increasingly secular. So Europe is becoming less religious. And so what's happening is that the school is replacing the role that the church used to play as the dominant ideological state apparatus in capitalist social formation. So in capitalist cultures, at one time, the church, I mean, this was waning even when I was a kid 50 years ago. But, if you go back 75 years, the church is pretty much the most powerful organization in almost any European town or even American town. Certainly, if you go back 70 years ago, 80 years ago, this is the case. But of course, Althusser's writing this while the church is sort of losing ground and people are losing faith. They're not attending church. And so they're not getting the message in the same numbers, right? Not as many people are going to church, so they're not hearing the ideological messages the church is handing out. And so what replaces this, in Althusser's eyes, is schooling. and of course public schooling in particular, right? I mean, this is one thing about American schools. American schools are remarkable. We spend something on the average around $200,000 on every child that goes to public school between K and 12th grade. Um, and it's amazing that we have a system that affords this, right? I mean, it's really a remarkable kind of idea. It comes straight out of the Enlightenment, the idea that there should be an informed populace, and so on. I mean, it's wonderful, right? It truly is. It's one of the most remarkable things about the Western world. However, right, on the other hand, you also have to look at this and say, okay, well, this is wild. There's a government organization in every town, right, every city, every place in the United States of America. It's run by the government, and you have to send your kids to school there. And if they don't go, you get in trouble. Right now, you can homeschool, right? But there's that's kind of a pain in the ass, and you got to jump through a lot of hoops to get there. But if you don't do that, you have to send them, and if you don't, you can go to jail, right? Because your kids need to go here and need to learn the lessons that the school is teaching them. And obviously, the school teaches some really great stuff: reading, writing, and arithmetic. But at the same time, of course, the school also teaches them ideology because you can't escape it. Ideology is everywhere. And, an argument can be made that ideology has to be learned simply so you can fit into society, right? I mean, we can argue back and forth about whether or not ideology is necessarily a false consciousness or, a form of social control. But you have to admit, even if you think it is a form of social control, that to some extent it's necessary to teach everyone in a country, a community, a certain way of seeing the world so that everyone can function in society together over an extended period of time, right? Um, so, for Althusser, because he's much more a kind of philosopher of suspicion, right? He says, it takes children from every class at infant school age, and then for years, the years in which a child is most vulnerable, squeezed between the family state apparatus and the educational state apparatus, it drums into them, whether it uses new or old methods, a certain amount of know-how wrapped in the ruling ideology. French, arithmetic, natural history, the sciences, literature, or simply the ruling ideology in its pure state, which we see when they teach you ethics or civics or even philosophy, right? So he's acute. I mean, he's very much saying, listen, the schools are teaching you this sort of distorted view of reality to keep you happy in your station. Um, and, I mean, one of the things with Marx is you know, Marx and neo-Marxist philosophers is that I often feel like I kind of have to put on my tinfoil hat when I teach some of this, because there is a certain degree of conspiracy theory-ish kind of thought that's going on here, right? This idea that the schools are inculcating our children with this ideology to keep them down. I mean, I'm not sure that's you know fair at all, right? I mean, there's certainly other ways of looking at it, right? But it does make for an interesting kind of reading, right? So again, Althusser's most famous because of the ISA and the RSA. These are two things that you need to know about for this course. You need to know about ideological state apparatuses and the repressive state apparatus. And you have to understand that the ISA is soft power and the RSA is hard power. And you have to understand what kind of organizations make up each, which hopefully I've explained clearly now. That's what Althusser is best known for, is this idea that I just explained. However, he does go on and make some other interesting and well-known assertions. And these are usually wrapped up in the three parts towards the end of the article that he calls theses concerning ideology. So here he's specifically coming up with different theses about ideology, what it is, and how it works. And so thesis one, right, he's got three of them. He says, ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to the real conditions of existence. So this he's borrowing directly from Marx, right? This idea that, ideology are the ideas of the ruling class, and that they're not accurate, they're not true, And if you learn them, you're not really able to understand your true position in the social order. You have a distorted view of reality and where you fit in. Thesis 2 is that ideology has a material existence, specifically in the apparatuses themselves. And so this is interesting, right? So ideology, when you think about ideology, you think about ideas, right? I mean, simply because it's ideology, right? But you think about ideas, and that seems reasonable. However, where Althusser takes it a step further, he says, no, it's not just ideas. It has a real material existence. And we can see it in material practices, right? Our rituals, our ceremonies, the things we do as a group, like standing up and putting your hand over your heart and pledging allegiance to the flag. That's a material, practice that is an actual physical instantiation or iteration of ideology, right? In the apparatuses themselves, I mean, the very existence of the family in the traditional sense, with the father as the patriarch, the mother being subservient to the father, and the kids being subservient to the parents, the social order, this hierarchy of power, and so on, he would say is embodied ideology, is a material existence. And then, of course, you have the institutions themselves, the jails, the school buildings, right? The robes that your professors wear that set them apart from you when you graduate, right? Like these are all material examples of ideology. These are the material. This is the material stuff that represents the ideas of the ruling class, right? And so it's kind of interesting to think about these ideas being manifest as things. And then he goes on and he says that he thinks that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals. So what it does is ideology pulls you in, right? Like ideology just doesn't exist out there and you run into it. Instead, ideology interpolates you is the term that he's using. And interpolation is another word for hailing, right? And hailing would be like, hey, you, that's hailing. And so he says, and this is a well-written kind of interesting passage. He says, I shall then suggest that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects. So it's actively recruiting you among the individuals. It recruits them all, or transforms individuals into subjects. It transforms them all. So what it does is, you're an individual, but the minute you step into ideology, the minute you're recruited by ideology, you become its subject, right? By the very precise operation which I have called interpolation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing, hey, you there. He goes on, assuming that the theoretical scene that I've imagined takes place in the street, the hailed individual will turn around. And by this mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject. So I know this is kind of maybe hard or weird to parse and to understand, and I'm going to give you kind of a vulgar example. But what he's saying here is that ideology calls out to you, and when you acknowledge it, you become part of it, right? You're no longer a free individual, but rather a subject of ideology, like the subject of a king, right? And so this would be, if somebody yells, hey, asshole, and you turn around, that makes you the asshole, right? And that's what ideology does. It's the cop, hey, you, and you turn around. The minute that happens, you become subject to the ideology, right? Like they pulled you in. You've become part of it. You acknowledge it. You acknowledge your role in this system. And in doing so, you become part of the system, right? So this is an interesting idea. So he goes on, and one of the interesting things about ideology is this notion that if it's the idea of the ruling class and it's common sense, and it's, some people like Zizek, the Slovenian philosopher, he says, ideology is reality, right? And if this is true, then there's no real way to get to see beyond it, right? There's no way to see beyond the forest for the trees. And this is what Althusser says. Althusser says, the ideology works on you before you're even born, right? And he says, because it starts working on you before you're even born, you're always already a subject, right? You never had a chance, in other words. Well, then you say, Eric, how does it work on you before you're born? Well, it works on you in a lot of ways, right? So before you're born, your parents name you. I name my kids manly names. Why? Because they're men, right? And we knew that they were going to be men. I painted the room blue. Well, why did I paint it blue? Because blue is associated with boys, right? The toys that they got before they were born fed into certain ideas about masculinity and the man's role in society and what's expected of them and what they're supposed to do and so on and so forth, right? It's always working on you before you even get here. So, he goes on, he says, an individual is subjected to various levels of ideological subjugation, and each level of subjugation, or each ISA that subjects the individual influences the individual's day-to-day activities, and thereby determines his real conditions of existence. What he's saying here is that ideology rules, right? It rules through oppression, and it rules through the ISA. You're constantly in the ISA, and the expectations that are put in front of you by the ISA. The school assignments, what you're supposed to do for Boy Scouts, what you're supposed to do for football practice, right? It's these ideological apparatuses that are determining the actual conditions of your lived existence. And so, therefore, how do you even see past them, right? If you spend all day as part of these organizations, like, how do you ever get out of it? If your family's one of these organizations, how do you ever get out of it? So you're always already subject to ideology. So further, he demonstrates that the recognition of oneself as a free subject within ideology is only a misrecognition. What he's saying is, you think you're free, but you're not. And indeed, imagining that you're free, imagining that you could get past the ideology is part of the ideology, right? You can never get past it. Your idea that you're a free American and you can do whatever you want, you can take whatever job you want. He would say, this is all just part of the plan, right? This is all just part of the ideology. And he says, in reality, you're subjugated, limited, restricted, and controlled by ideology to such an extent that you have very limited freedom and very little individual agency. And maybe some of you think that already, right? It's particularly true when you're younger. What are you going to do? Not go to elementary school, right? Not go to soccer practice when your parents drive you there? Not go to college when everybody knows you quote unquote knows that you need to go to college to get a good job, right? Your decisions are kind of made for you. What are you going to do? Go live in the woods like the Unabomber and not go get a real job? You see how this works? And he goes on and says, due to this misrecognition, the subject acts and practices rituals steeped in the dominant ideologies that are detrimental to his or her own welfare. One of the questions that these philosophers try and answer is, why do people do things that aren't in their own best interest? And this is a question that's interested me as well for a long time. I've oftentimes wondered, for example, and I'm not trying to, I'll preface this by saying I'm not trying to rag on the military. I'm glad that people are in the military and defending my freedom. But nevertheless, I've wondered at times, why would you risk your life for your country when the people who are sending you out to fight wars are not fighting them themselves? That seems like a bad idea. That seems like it's counter to your own interests. Now, again, I'm glad that people do that, but I've oftentimes wondered, why would they? I might be willing to do it if the folks who are, all gung-ho about war were standing next to me when the shooting started. But that doesn't seem to be the way it works, right? So I wonder, why would someone do that? Well, the answer is ideology, right? Why would I vote for a political party just because of my feelings and not because they actually do things to represent me? Well, it's ideology, right? I see this kind of uh, behavior all the time. I know plenty of very poor people, rural people that live in the country who are staunch conservatives, right? People who literally can't afford the insulin that they need for their diabetes, but are wildly against, free health care for all, nationalized health care, because they think that that's a communist idea. Now, of course, it would help them. It would help them live longer, literally. But they're like, nah, fuck that. That's communism. Well, I mean, it's perhaps it is some kind of socialism, but nevertheless, it would help you live longer, right? So why would you be against it? And the answer again is ideology. You need to work, you need to earn your money, and then you buy the stuff you need. And if you can't do that, you're not a man, and so on and so forth, right? Um, that's how ideology works, and those are the kinds of questions that people seek to answer. And it also explains to an extent why the revolution never came. I mean, this is one of the questions they're grappling with here. Writing 50, 60, 70, 80 years after Marx, now more than 100, right? Uh, People are wondering, like, why, Marx predicted that there would be this revolution, and he saw it happening in the United Kingdom, right? He saw it happening in England is where he expected it to happen. And of course, it didn't happen there. It happened in the Soviet Union. But he expected it to happen everywhere, and it never did. And so, of course, this left a bunch of Marxist philosophers all sitting around being like, oh, why didn't it happen? Was this all bullshit? And so they had to come up with answers as to why it didn't happen. Well, one answer is this power of ideology that we can't escape, right? If you can't escape ideology, you never recognize how bad your situation is, and therefore you don't commit revolution, and you're just happy with bread and circuses kind of thing, right? All right, well, I hope I explained this all. I know that we're getting into some heavier stuff, but again, I mean, I hope I explained it. And if I didn't, please reach out. If you want some extra help or want to discuss some ideas, I'm just an email away. So please don't forget that. Okay? Thanks again for checking out my video, and I'll talk at you later.